As a scholar, do you worry that we might lose that historical background of music at some point if we don't continue to do what you're doing in remembering our past in the music history that brought us to the point where we are now?
I think so in a certain way, but also I've tried to avoid some of the more fatalistic stances that have plagued folklore for many, many years. That modern technology will completely overtake or undermine folk tradition. I feel in some ways we're in a very unique position in the 21st century where we have access to technology that allows us to see all of the archives at one time, which is something that physically human beings have not been able to do with every single folkloric recording created by mankind since the beginning. We haven't been able to do that just because physically there aren't enough people to do it. But now we have a technology that allows us to do that, which allows us to have deeper forensics into the research and scholarship of folk music, which also makes us need to go back to the earliest folk music documentation and reanalyze it, whether for good or bad. And so I feel in some ways there's so many opportunities that are out there. As a scholar, I'm continuing to research for new stories and new songs, and I'm also pleased to see the new scholarship and research. It's sort of a golden age for that new scholarship and research about songs that at one point were only just as old as the hills based on the original scholarship, but now we find those hills have stories, and those stories sometimes are much more relevant and much more poignant than we give them credit for, which is what folk music, that's what interested me in the first place. I was a fan of history in the first place, and so if I can find more about who John Henry as a person is compared to John Henry as just a legend, that's interesting to me. And I feel like we are in a position where so many of the young people are not, I'm going to say, they're not, they don't have the obstacles of previous generations in terms of there being a set series of rules when it comes to how folklore is being discussed. But at the same time, there's a reason they made any number of these folkloric systems in the universities, because they had the same questions. What is folk music? Why is it not popular music? What is popular music? And then how do you reinterpret it without losing any essence of the folk or the popular? So it's a constant question. But for me as a scholar, I feel like we are in such an exciting period, especially because the young people want to play folk music instead of us needing to always have to actively teach them. There's actually a two-way street that's beginning to grow in these generations coming.
There's another interesting aspect too for me. Now musicians more than ever, especially young musicians coming in, have this ability to control and tell their story a little bit better, as you were mentioning. Could you imagine if the Charlie Pools of the world or the Robert Johnsons of the world had this technology to tell their folklore stories and to tell their songs?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned Charlie Poole. See, because now in reanalyzing, Charlie Poole is almost a lot like a millennial musician in the way that he had access to wax cylinders and early 78 recordings. And so one of the reasons, and Robert Johnson has a similar story for being in Mississippi. One of the things that made them such phenomenal musicians is by hearsay, happenstance, legend, and some fact that they had access to early recordings. So they were able to gain a much broader repertoire than they might have been able to in a fully organic Southern traditional setting. So we have a version of almost a super music that grows with a person like Charlie Poole, where it is equally as rooted in Tin Pan Alley as it is in rural Southern folk tradition. But then Charlie Poole adds a little something extra, which of course we now would call three-finger banjo style, or the predecessors to three-finger, which of course when you begin to reanalyze Charlie Poole, you find that his favorite banjo player was Wes Osman, which begins to open up a whole other branch of the banjo's history. So again, in the 21st century, kids have access to this whole story, where before I might have gone down to Mount Airy, North Carolina, met Marvin Gaster. He would tell me the story about Charlie Poole, and then I would have to find an article, a book, or go to Ferrum College. Again, I'm from Phoenix, so I had to go to Chapel Hill, then Ferrum, then Lexington, then Mount Airy, North Carolina, to get all of this information myself back in 2005. Now kids can just look it up online and it's all there, which I think is a great accomplishment. But at the same time, there's also the one thing I do feel sometimes can be missed, not impossible to get it, is the traveling down to the South, particularly. I was learning the music before, but until I moved to North Carolina, began to live in the South, and began to really take in the musical tradition on the ground level, as they say, that was when I began to find my true education began. And I feel that it can be easy to miss that education because there's less of a need to leave the house. And of course, in the recent years, there's less need to leave the house. But part of the thing that makes folk music so wonderful is that in the best of times, you can journey far beyond your immediate environment, and the songs or the people can take you beyond that immediate environment. And that's a journey in of itself, and that can last you a whole lifetime. I'm still on that journey.